In competitive sports, everyone's always looking for an edge. But what happens when the world of UFC and the world of magic collide? KO! And then we take a look at the amazing world of ghouls. An ancient creature most would consider a myth. But what happens when a myth turns into a fact? What happens when a childhood fear turns into a cryptid? What happens when a mystical guardian of the dead is unleashed during the darkest days of war? Today on Dead Rabbit Radio. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Dead Rabbit Radio. I'm your host, Jason Carpenter. I'm having a good day. I hope you guys are having a good day too. I hope you guys had an awesome weekend. I hope you guys had lots of fun over the weekend. We got a lot of stuff to cover today, so first off, running into Dead Rabbit Radio Command, lifting massive weights in each arm. Everyone get on your feet and give it up for our newest Patreon supporter, Abbelschorle 420. He's all lifting up his weight. Oh wait, we're supposed to be clapping. Whee! Yay! We're clapping as Abbelschorle 420 comes running into Dead Rabbit Radio Command, lifting weights. Abbelschorle is our newest Patreon supporter. I didn't know how to pronounce their name. It's a German word. Apparently, well, according to Abbelschorle 420, because I go, what is that? How do you even say your name? They explained how they said their name. They said it's a popular apple drink in Germany. Now, I shouldn't call out. I don't know. He might be right. Probably shouldn't call him a liar. Thanks for supporting the show. I go, oh, okay, popular apple drink. So I typed it into Google. Apparently, it is an apple drink. But if you type in Abbelschorle into Google, every single photo is a picture of a 400-pound weightlifter drinking apple juice. There has to be something more to this story. There's not a photo of a single normal human being drinking this. It's all pictures of this massive weightlifter drinking this. I don't know if Abbelschorle 420 was being completely on. Oh, it's a popular drink among one guy. One guy drinks it, but he's pretty popular. Anyways, Abbelschorle, thank you so much for supporting the show. Abbelschorle 420, thank you so much for supporting the show. You're going to be our captain, our pilot this episode. If you guys can't support the show financially, I totally understand. I really, really do. I really do. Just help spread the word about Dead Rabbit Radio. That helps out so much. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell everyone you know. Dead Rabbit Radio is your favorite paranormal show. Abbelschorle 420, let's go ahead and toss you the keys to the Jason Jalopy. Everyone climb on board of this rickety old chitty chitty bang bang car as Abbelschorle drives us out of Dead Rabbit Radio Command and all the way down to Las Vegas. We're headed all the way down to Las Vegas, Nevada. Specifically, we're headed to the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. It's June 29th, 2024, almost as recent as the story as we can get. We're recording this episode on June 30th, 2024. We're headed to the T-Mobile Arena. It's a UFC event. We see all these people in the audience. They're all sweaty. They're ready to watch people bleed. They're ready to watch titans fight. And sure enough, people are out there getting punched in the stomach, and the ref's like, no, you lose. And the guy's like, what did you just start a second ago? All I did was punch him in the stomach. And the ref's like, I have a low tolerance for pain in other people. You lose! And we're watching this fight. But this is more than just a UFC fight. This story was sent to me by Biggie Cheese on the Patreon Discord. Like, really got me pumped up because I didn't know any of this story. It's an absolutely fascinating story that I'll have you asking. Should magic be illegal in sports? Actually, probably a question nobody's ever asked. They're like, oh, magic isn't real, Jason, so no, it shouldn't be. What's been going on as they've been getting ready for this fight? Basically, on June 29th, 2024, there was a rematch. Back in November, two fighters. Be prepared for multiple pronunciation errors in this one. There's a guy named Jiri Prochazka back in November, Jiri, I'll pause for all the UFC fans to shut it off. They're like, he doesn't know how to pronounce this guy's name. Jiri was a light heavyweight champion back in November, and he had to fight this guy who's had a very, very fast rise in the sport of UFC. This Brazilian fighter named Alex Pereira. And they fought back in November, and Alex won. Alex won the belt. He's now the light heavyweight championship. Now, normally they wait a while before they have another one of these fights, but because of all these extenuating circumstances, they needed to fight again. There was a bunch of shuffling around with the card, and the UFC's like, we need another big fight for this pay-per-view. They just fought again on June 29th, 2024, but the drama started before the fight. Because there's a podcast or a YouTube show called the MMA Hour, and they were interviewing Jiri in preparation for the fight. And Jiri was, he'd already been beat by this guy once. So you figure you need to get back in the ring and show that you have what it takes to win the belt back. Maybe a little bit of trash talking in there, maybe trying to psych out your opponent. Well, Jiri, he had a very interesting tact to take during this interview. He said, listen, I can beat Alex as long as he doesn't use magic. You're like, wait, is that like a slang term for steroids or something? No. Actual magic. He's not a good fighter, but the problem is he always has these spirits flying around him. It's really hard. You're trying to kick a guy, you kick like a 10,000-year-old ancestral spirit, and the ghost blocks your kick. He goes, it's really hard to fight a guy who has magic on his side. And everybody knows this. Everyone's fully aware that this guy has spirits floating around him. Now, you, Jason, maybe you misread the quote. Maybe you clicked on a D&D article instead of a UFC article. This is his actual quote. He goes, quote, I think he believes a lot in help of spiritual things. This is what Jiri's saying. And that's something I think he can't fight without, because I want to keep that in a clear line. Just the sport performance, pure performance, man versus man. I think he doesn't know how to fight without that, because he used these things every time, unquote. He has these spirits floating around him. He also says everybody knows this. It's not a secret. If you spend any money, he's all sitting there, he's hovering above the ground like Dalzim in Street Fighter 2. You're like, I think there's something spiritual about him. Yuri's like, everyone knows he uses magic. And what's funny is I didn't know any of these fighters before Biggie Cheese sent me over this story. So I typed in their names and I just randomly clicking on links. And then I had all these, tabs open, and I started going through them. And the very first one I clicked on was a YouTube video. And it was kind of like the pre-fight thing where they bring both fighters out on stage, and Joe Rogan's there, and he's kind of asking them questions. I think it was Joe Rogan. It was a bald-headed dude. Might have been Dana White, but pretty sure it was Joe Rogan. They're all standing on the stage, and they kind of trash talk each other, get the audience hyped up. It's like a pre-fight press conference. And the camera is focused on Jiri. And the interviewer goes, hey, what's this whole thing about magic? What's this whole thing where you're saying you can't use magic? And Jiri basically says the same thing. He goes, I think that he needs to fight man to man. I don't think he should have any help, spiritual things, so on and so forth. He should just fight me man to man, and we should just do what our physical strength is. And he's kind of saying this. And then as the interviewer is walking over to Alex, who I'd never seen before, the camera pans over to a 6'5" guy wearing a full ceremonial headdress, and his face is painted, and he has all these rituals, all of these symbols drawn on his face and his body. I go, oh, he is using magic. If anyone in the world, it was like a comedy sketch, if anyone in the world, the way that camera panned over, if anyone in the world was using magic to win the fight, it'd be him. It'd be Alex, and Alex was basically like, we'll see what happens. We'll go into the ring and see what happens. I don't know why I made him sound like Herman Munster, but when Alex was accused of using magic, his first response was, it's really interesting. He said, quote, Well, everybody has their own spirits. We're not made of flesh and bone. I have found mine. If he did not find his, or he does not believe, that's not my fault. Unquote. So basically he's confirming he does use magic. He has these ancestral spirits around him. And he's going, well, the fight might not be fair because he doesn't have ghosts with him. He doesn't have like George Washington blocking away my Brazilian ancestor ghost. So that's more on him. He should be magical too. It's not just me. And what's interesting is, to be fair, Jiri, the Czechoslovakian fighter, is also prone to do some odd things. I'm not saying that they're bad. Like, he follows the philosophy of Bushido, and he models his life after that of a samurai. That's cool, right? But then, I mean, like, I can get behind that, right? But then, you know, he had this fight in November. He lost the title, and when all this stuff happened and they needed a new fight, so these guys are going to fight again. Normally, they don't happen this quick. Yuri's manager said, hey, dude, you're going to fight Alex again. You're going to fight Alex again in a couple months. And so Jiri, to train for that, to the start of the training, it wasn't the end of the training. It definitely wouldn't have worked if he did it at the end. When he heard the news that he was going to fight Alex again, he locked himself in a shed with no food or water or light for 3 days. And then he came out, he's like, okay, let's train. So, I mean, he's doing some weird stuff, too. To be honest, having help from your ancestral spirits is a little less weird than not eating. Not eating for 3 days is nothing. Not drinking water for 3 days is something, right? That's taking it to the edge of death. No lights, sitting in a room for 3 days. I mean, he's definitely psyching himself up. Well, last night was the fight. It's 6/29/2024. Alex and Jiri were getting ready to fight, and I went to go see A Quiet Place, day one. Wanted to go check it out. My movie theater here in town actually might be shutting down, Andrew's Pizza and Skylight Theater, so it was like the second to last day. They may not show movies anymore. Hopefully they do. We got a new owner, but had to go see A Quiet Place. And I'm checking my phone. I'm the guy in the movie. Everyone's like, oh no, be quiet, here comes the monsters. And I was like, yeah! Cheering on. No, I checked my phone after I left the theater, but first thing I did was I started checking my phone. The fight lasted 2 rounds, and Alex devastated him. Alex kicked him right in the head and basically knocked him out, and then began punching him multiple times as he's laying on the ground, and the ref's like, no, let me jump in there. And so Alex is still the champion. I mean, it was a fast fight. And what's interesting is all these guys are world-class athletes. So when 2 of them get in the ring and the fight's over in 2 minutes, like, it happens. But then you think, like, okay, so if I fought him, would I lose the fight in, like, -5 minutes? Like, he can disassemble this other pro athlete. But yeah, he came out and just, it was over. It was over. The doctor had to come in, and Yuri's like, what, am I still in that room? What, is this all an illusion? Am I still in this room? Is it only day 3? Are the lights still out? And the doctor's like, yeah, the lights are out. We gotta, like, get you, they bring a stool so he can sit up because he can barely stand. Brutal fight. Now, there's a lot of interesting questions we have about this. Is Alex actually using magic? Like, is he actually using spiritual powers to win? And if he is that fair? And what's funny, I really think the answer to both of those questions are yes. Whether or not Alex actually has the help of spirits around him, you see like a towel floating around, he has no coach, he has no team, this water bottle's floating next to him, he's all drinking the water, and this towel, people are like, well, no, I guess he really does have spirits. He's floating around, it's all these fighters who have died in the past that tell the Huns there, he's like, stab him in the heart. Whether or not he actually does, obviously I believe in spiritual powers and things like that. He believes it. That might give him extra motivation, but I think there probably is more of a literal thing here. Probably is using some sort of spiritual power, and if he is that fair? And it is. He really sums it up. It's like, it's not my fault that he doesn't have any ghosts. Maybe instead of spending 3 days in a dark room, maybe you should go to graveyards, stuff like that. Try to find some Czechoslovakian ghosts. It's funny, too. Well, not funny. This part's actually kind of depressing, but I'd never heard about any of these fighters, any of this stuff. Like I said, I'm such a casual fan. Like, I'll watch highlights on YouTube from time to time. There's a documentary on YouTube I'll put in the show notes about the life story of Alex. And he was born in the slums of Brazil. He dropped out of school at age 12 so he could help support his family. He worked at a mechanic shop. Age 12, you pull in your car to get it fixed. You see this little 12-year-old kid walk out and he's all changing your oil. You're like, shouldn't you be in school, son? He goes, this is my school. School of Hard Knocks. His coworkers were all adults, so he started drinking at a really young age. And he goes, at my worst, I was drinking like a liter of alcohol a day. And then he ended up becoming a kickboxer in Brazil. It's kind of a weird segue. He's all kicking lug nuts off of cars. People are like, hey, kid, I can make you a star. You're really good. He ends up becoming a kickboxer, becomes really the best kickboxer in Brazil. He wins the Brazilian championship. He's doing all these kickboxing stuff. He's still a hardcore alcoholic. His coach is like, dude, do you know how good of a kickboxer you would be if you'd stop drinking? You're already the best in the country, if not all of South America. He ends up fighting this guy in this kickboxing match. His name was Israel Adesanya. And Alex knocks him out. Lays him out, right, in the middle of this fight. Well, then, years go by. And Israel goes to the UFC. So now he's a UFC. He's rising really fast in the ranks. People are like, dude, who's this Israel guy? He kind of came out of nowhere. And what happens is basically from like 6-10 years earlier, this YouTube video starts circulating of Israel getting knocked out by this unknown kickboxer. I mean, at least in America, a lot of people didn't know who he was. Israel, who was one of the best fighters in UFC, people are like, oh, this guy could be a champ. There's video of him getting knocked out. No one had ever seen him get knocked out before. So then people start asking, well, who's this Alex guy? And Alex is just kind of putzing around in Brazil. And people asked, there was this interview, and they asked Israel, and he's in the UFC, and they go, so who's this dude who, like, knocked you out? Israel goes, I'm going to tell you something right now. I'm going to be a champ. I'm on my way to being the biggest name in the UFC. That guy's going to be sitting in a bar someday, drinking, pointing at the television and saying, I beat that guy up once. I knocked that guy out. He goes, that's what's going to happen. And Alex was in Brazil and he saw that interview. And he goes, okay, I guess I'm going to join the UFC. I guess I'm going to start fighting again and join the UFC. And he did. And he's been just knocking people out. He joined the UFC. He beat Israel at the UFC fights. And he's just been knocking people out ever since. Like, he literally was that guy on the couch. Someone was trash talking. And he goes, okay, that's okay. If you want to trash talk, I'm going to go fight you again. I'm going to join the UFC. And now he's a 2-time champion. He's won 2 championship belts. He's had like 12 fights. So I thought that was an interesting story as well. And I think that's like very motivational. Super motivational. Now, this guy is a genetic freak. A lot of people say that, his body was built to be a fighter. He was born different than most people. But, yeah, I thought that was super motivating, right? Because a lot of times we feel like we're stuck in that rut. And sometimes it takes a kick in the butt. Sometimes it takes someone trash talking us, because he knew that was true. Alex 100% knew that was where he was headed. He was going to be the guy in the bar. It really rang true to him. And he'd struggle with alcohol. His coach was the one who said, dude, you need to stop drinking. Let's go back. And he took Alex to where his ancestors were, this tribe in Brazil, and said, you need to look at your roots. You need to follow the path of your ancestors. So he started hanging out with shamans. And since he's won these UFC belts, he's brought them back to this village. I'm going to put all this stuff in the show notes. There's some really cool little YouTube documentaries and all this stuff about him. But I thought that was such an amazing thing. It was just a kick in the butt. That was a fascinating story. Biggie Cheese, thanks so much for sending that over. Really enjoyed it. I thought that was definitely an Abbelschorle, since that guy's also like a 400-pound weightlifter. He might enjoy it as well. Abbelschorle 420. Let's go ahead and toss you the keys to the world. Famous Carbonocopter, we are leaving behind Las Vegas. Why don't you fly us all the way out to Afghanistan? Headed all the way out to Afghanistan. We're going to take a look at ghouls. Ghouls. Now, what's funny is that what is there to talk about? They're very famous monsters. That'd be like doing an episode on vampires. Have you guys ever heard about vampires? Well, strap it. Because this episode definitely won't suck. There's not much you can say about vampires or werewolves or ghouls. What's next, Jason? An episode about unicorns? Well, no. Unless I come across some unicorn-related information as interesting as this. Because you know what we like to do on the show, right? We try to find, like, the bizarre angles to some of these things. We're going to talk about a ghoul conspiracy theory. Something I never thought of before. But as I was looking this up, because I came across the story and I was like, okay, what can I say about it? It's ghouls. But over the next couple of days, I kept thinking about it again. I was like, you know what? This is actually a really cool ghoul-oriented conspiracy theory. So I eventually just kind of bit the bullet and started doing a bunch of ghoul research. I'm all at graveyards. I'm all eating corpses. I was like, to be like one, you must eat like one. The ghoul. It's an Arabic creature. Ghouls are from Arabic lore. There's a word where ghoul comes from. It's gala, which means to snatch or seize. And that's where the idea of these ghouls, they go through the graveyards, they eat the dead. Sometimes they'll kill the living and then eat them when they're dead. Sometimes they're self-starters. They're like, oh, this graveyard, I can dig 6 feet into the earth. Or they see a little kid walking by the graveyard. But originally in Arabic culture, they were shapeshifters. They were beautiful women who would be standing in the middle of nowhere and a traveler would show up and she would trick the traveler to go with her and she would murder him. That's super common in most cultures. The shapeshifter killing the wayward traveler. A beautiful woman distracting someone. We've covered a ton of stories like that. And really, because a lot of these cryptid stories, they have this idea of teaching a lesson. The lesson in that is, don't follow beautiful women into the middle of the Amazon rainforest. If you see a beautiful woman standing by the edge of a lake, don't go there because she'll drown you. And I think it was partially being told by a lot of wives, right? The wives are like, oh, I know that you've been thinking about cheating on me, but did you know the person that you might sleep with might actually be a ghoul? They're like, what? Also because young men tend to think not so much with their brain. So you see a beautiful woman, in real life she could just clobber you over the head, or there's a bunch of brigands hiding around the corner and they clobber you over the head. But we see the story a lot about shape-shifting women who are actually monsters. That's where the story of the ghoul came from this Arabic thing. But over time, I found this super fascinating. Now, even in the Middle East, ghoul means a creature that eats the dead. And again, will kill the living to eat them as well. But basically a monster. A zombie type creature. They were the dead who were eating human flesh. They were a ghoul. That's kind of what these creatures morphed into over time. Originally it was this woman in the middle of the wilderness. Now it's a ghoul. What happened was the story left the Middle East, went to Europe in the form of 1001 Arabian Nights. And the guy who translated it in Europe was changing a bunch of stuff. He's like, oh, I'm going to make a sequel, 2000 Nights. People are like, oh, man, I could barely read the first book. He's like, no, this one's better. He changed a bunch of stuff, and I guess he added these ghouls in it. They're like, what? I don't remember this version. He's like, yeah, it was totally awesome. A bunch of ghouls showed up. And then the author puts his self-insert in there. He's like, and then I showed up. I was the best fighter in the world. And then it circled back around in the Middle East. So now, even today in the Middle East, they think of ghouls as these zombies. So here's my first question, because I don't want to just read off trivia. I found that interesting. At what point, it's interesting that the myth started off for hundreds of years, if not close to 1,000 years. It was the woman in the woods, or the woman by the river, or the woman in the desert, or whatever, who was a shapeshifter. Then it became, no, that's dumb. every other culture on the planet was afraid of that. The ghouls are actually these mindless monsters that eat flesh, and then it went back to Arabia, went back to the Middle East, and they go, oh yeah, that's way better. That's way, way better. So at what point is it real? Which version is real? Is there still a cryptid or a spiritual force out there in the Middle East that now nobody talks about? Nobody warns anyone about the powerful, beautiful woman, the shapeshifter in the middle of nowhere. Because people don't tell that story anymore. It's been replaced with these ghouls. Which is interesting because the biggest defense against a cryptid, the biggest defense against one of these spiritual enemies, is knowing it exists. So if that's been removed, someone's like, hey, don't, there's like an old man in the village. He's like, don't go over there. There's a ghoul. And you're like, phew. But then you go over there because you're curious. You're like, oh, what? You've never thought about going over there? You're like, but that old man says there's ghouls? That's awesome. I'd go over there. You go over there, you don't see any zombies, but you see a beautiful woman. And she's like, oh man, I just got done chasing all those ghouls out of here. There's a bunch of ghouls. You just missed them. They all moved to Canada. You'll never meet them. And you're like, oh man. She's like, hey, but why don't you come back to my house? I'll show you photos of me fighting ghouls. And you're like, yeah, that's pretty cool. You probably would have went with her anyways. She's a beautiful woman in the middle of nowhere. You're like, photos? Black! You gotta show me. High definition video. I'm out of here, lady. You would have went with her anyways. But anyways, then you go to her house and she eats you. She's like, I was the ghoul all along. You're like, no. If you don't know these things exist, it actually makes them harder to defeat. It's the same thing. That's why police try to let people know when there's a serial killer in town, because that way you know, well, maybe I shouldn't go for my normal midnight walk. They usually will say, hey, there's a serial killer around. You know, they'll wait a couple, 4 or 5 victims. But after that, they'll release a bulletin and you'll go, wow, there's a serial killer in town. I just move, really. I'm reading about these ghouls. I have a bunch of different sources as I'm checking all this stuff out. One of them, this was on the website How Stuff Works. You know that website you go to find out, like, hey, how did they put a cable that goes all the way from America to Europe so we could call each other? They had to put down this undersea cable. It was like the biggest engineering project at the time. It was in the early 1900s, I think it was. Cost billions of dollars, at least in nowadays money. How Stuff Works. What happens when you really mix vinegar and baking soda? Like, all this science stuff. Well, apparently How Stuff Works actually has a section on ghouls. I was like, I don't know if, listen, I like that there's this information out there. Don't know if this is the right source for it or website for it. It was posted by a guy named Robert Lamb, and I looked through his posts. He writes all sorts of fun and goofy stuff, like, could we really have mechs? If you flew a plane over an earthquake, would you feel it? So he kind of does fun stuff. I mean, unless you're in the plane, you're like, oh no, that article was wrong. You crash into the ground. So anyways, he wrote about ghouls. And he's looking at all these sources. He cites all of his sources. And I thought this was super interesting, because when I think of ghouls personally, I think, for some reason, I imagine them wearing robes. I think I think of cartoon ghouls, like green ghouls. I don't even think of zombies. I don't think of humans. I imagine them having little daggers and they're jumping around. They're like, come and fight us. Come and fight us. Good. I'm jumping too much. I'm hitting my microphone. Come and fight us. Ah! I think of little green ghouls. But that's just because of cartoons. Ghouls are basically, if I can't imagine those guys, I imagine them like zombies, right? Humans that are starting to not look human, or they're just decaying or whatever, and they eat the flesh of the living. Well, Robert had an interesting description of these. He cited all of his sources, and I didn't see a particular source that would have pegged this as something. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. He described the ghouls as looking like this. He goes, they're emaciated. Not a lot of calories in dead flesh, apparently. It's not good for putting on weight. He goes, they're emaciated. He said they walk on 2 legs. They are bipedal, but a lot of times they will walk on 4. Not 4 legs. They'll walk on their hands and their feet. Allows them to move quicker, allows them to hunt. Because when they're trying to kill a living person, it's all about that speed. If they're digging up a grave, they actually have claws to help dig into the dirt. He says they tend to have gray or pale skin. Should make sense, right? They don't get a lot of sunlight. They are monsters of the dark. He said they're hairless. It's so weird because I never put this together. There is a cryptid that 100% matches that description. I've seen one. We call them crawlers. I'll put episodes in the show notes. But if you describe those exact words, that's a crawler. That is a cryptid that is humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, neck, head, torso, all that stuff. They walk on all 4s, but they can stand on just their legs if they wanted. Emaciated, gray or pale skin, hairless. And that's, again, so the thing with the crawlers, which I've personally seen at least 1, maybe 2. The second time I saw it, it was at more of a distance. It was fast, whatever it was. That's the one that I would say, because it was running towards me, but I was on a staircase looking down. That's the one that 100% could have been an animal. When I shouldn't say 100%, 90%, but when I was within maybe 10 or 15 feet of one of these things, and I only saw its back half, the way its body was angled was as if a human was walking on their hands and their feet. All I saw was the back of the body and the legs. It was amazing. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know there was a term for these things. When I was walking to work one day real early in the morning, I saw this thing. I didn't see the front half of it because it was in front of a car. There was a parked car, but I see the back half. Clear as I can see this microphone in front of me. 100%. It was emaciated, it was pale, and it looked like it was walking on its back feet. Now, you go, Jason, maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was a Great Dane. Maybe it was a whole bunch of things. But what none of that stuff accounts for is that I saw it and I watched it walk behind the car, and it was not a brief, split-second thing. And because I saw it walk behind this parked car, I didn't know what it was. I assumed it was some sort of wild animal. So then I walked out into the middle of the street, because there was no traffic at the time, to give myself a wide berth. And as I'm walking out in the middle of the street, I'm looking to see what it is, what is hiding now behind the car, because I didn't see it emerge from the other side. It was gone. It had vanished. And I remember looking at where it should have been. If it was a dog or a bear or something like that, they may look disgusting if they have some weird wasting disease. They don't waste away. They don't teleport away. They don't die in that moment and then cease to exist. It vanished. I didn't know what it was at the time. I did an episode on it years later. I had seen that, I think, predating the show even. And I had some of you guys say, hey, that's a thing called a crawler. People have pointed that out. But the question has been, what are the crawlers? There are websites, there's subreddits for these things, but what are they? Is it possible they're ghouls? Is the crawler a new name for an old creature? Because it definitely matches that description. Now, that is what Robert Lamb described them as. We're going to get to another description in a second to kind of wrap all this stuff up. But that's another super interesting. I came across it. I was reading this and I go, we don't know where the crawlers come from. We don't know why they are here. Which happens sometimes with cryptids. We can kind of understand, Bigfoot. Let's take the biological Bigfoot thing rather than it being interdimensional. It's in an area, the same reason why any animal's in an area. It's the animal's habitat. They're in these particular parts of the world. One, because it's easy to kind of get lost and not be hunted, but it's where their food source is. It's where their ancestral homes are. These Bigfoots that have kind of walked over the Bering Strait ice bridge. That explains why they're there. We can look at some cryptids and go, well, that's why this is here. When the boogeyman, right? The boogeyman's just there to be scary. We don't have the boogeyman's habitat is under your bed. Your bed specifically. It really likes the way you smell. Can't wait to eat you. Some of these are just monsters. The crawler, the question has been, what are these things? Where do they come from? Why are they here? Is it possible that they're ghouls? And we'll get to why they're here in a second, but thought that was interesting. Also, Robert Lamb says a lot, and I heard this echoed across a couple different places, that ghouls don't like bright lights. They don't like the sun. They don't like loud places. So a lot of times they'll be in environments that are wilderness or rural or underground. They prefer being underground. Which is funny because we covered that story not too long ago about that woman. I think I'll put it in the show notes, but I think she was in Appalachia or somewhere, and she went into a tunnel and she ran into a ton of these pale humanoid creatures that were kind of running after her in the tunnel, and when she got out into the sunlight, they stopped chasing her, type of thing. So it would kind of also be along that. Now, Hugo Jason, here's the thing, like, that's not a zombie now. That's almost like a new creature. You said ghouls are things that eat the dead, and then you get talking about zombies and stuff like that, and wearing green cloaks. You're like, I don't even know what's going on anymore. You're just kind of jumping around. We're building to something. That's how I always figured ghouls were like. We're just, if they weren't wearing cloaks and had daggers, they were just kind of humans. They were just kind of like these wasting away humans that would eat dead people or living people and make them dead and then eat them. But it doesn't, are these crawlers, which in a sense people have described, they look like, some are very tall, but some of them are, 6 feet tall, normal human size. Walking on all fours, it still looked like a human, like the way the back was arched. Whatever I saw walk by, it's, you know what I mean? It wasn't like a bear walking where it's pretty symmetrical. It's like a human walking, where if you do, you're going to have your butt's going to be up in the air. It was more like that. What are the crawlers? Why are they here? Are ghouls crawlers? Could you start off? There's different origin stories of what makes you a ghoul. Some people say that it's a curse. You get cursed to become a ghoul. Some people say it's how evil your soul is can turn you into a ghoul. That's one version. I thought this was like totally badass. That ghouls, a long time ago, a bunch of angels, after they were sent down to earth during this war in heaven, these fallen angels tried one day, they're like, you know what, let's just fly back to heaven. I know we were all thrown down during that great war, but I think we do have wings, by the way. I'm sure we can fly back up there. And as they were flying back up to heaven, this meteor storm, asteroids, meteorites, whatever you want to call them, come flying through and smash into these angels that are trying to get back into heaven. And some of them, when they were hit with this meteorite, were completely scorched. And it burned their bodies up, and it completely, ruined them. And they became ghouls. And then the rest of them, when they got hit by these meteorites, they all turned into crocodiles. Which I would say, kind of got to pick your poison on that one. Would you rather be a flesh-eating monster roaming the land looking for dead meat, or are you just a crocodile? Right, you don't get to do as much walking around. You just kind of sit there in the water. But at least I'm sure that the crocodile's meals taste a little bit better than rotting flesh. Just saying, I'm not a culinary expert. That's an old story about them. Anyways, what I'm building to is the reason why I got into this ghoul story to begin with is I was looking for stuff. I was looking for fun stuff to talk about. I never would have thought I'd do a segment on ghouls because they're just pretty well-known monster, cryptid, whatever you have. I came across this post by someone going by the name Zickowik. And on this board, on this subreddit, someone asked the question, what paranormal creatures have you seen? And I don't know if this is kind of not really what the question was asked, because he goes, ghouls! Ghouls! And I was like, oh, he's seen a ghoul? He doesn't say that he actually saw a ghoul. But he gives me an angle on ghouls I've never heard before, which would kind of actually explain a lot. Because as far as I can tell, crawlers are a fairly recent cryptid creature type of thing. There are some, I know we talk about, indigenous people having encounters with the Bigfoot. That one we can trace a bit farther back. But a lot of cryptids, a lot of these stories, they're actually more recent than you would think. Like, obviously, vampire. I think the first vampire story, the first, vampires might be real, was like 1000 AD. It was from Russia. 1079 AD, somewhere around there. That's pretty late in human development to start talking about these blood-sucking freaks, which makes you think that what caused those stories to start then? You go, well, Jason, they're just stories. Vampires aren't real. You break my heart. You're making me sad because I love vampires. Oh, no. Don't tell me that. No. Why would it start then? Was at that time people starting to finally see these things or experience these monsters? I don't know when crawlers started, but this is interesting. It doesn't match up completely, and I will be honest with that. I'm not going to leave out details just to fit my conspiracy theory, but Zikowicz says, ghouls are these creatures. They actually are completely black. Their flesh looks like it's rotting right off of them. They have these long claws, foot-long claws to help them dig into the dirt. But they're kind of just these creatures. They hate living in cities. They like to be in the dark. Kind of the same thing that we heard the description of Robert Lamb. The big difference is what they look like. Black skin versus white, pale, emaciated skin. Maybe it's the difference between a fresh ghoul and a ghoul that's been here for a while. I don't know, but I didn't want to say that because this doesn't match up completely. But putting that aside, what he said they looked like, setting aside what this guy said they looked like, this was a really interesting, I don't know if conspiracy theory is the right word, but it would explain a lot about these things. He said ghouls were created, because that is another origin story, that you actually can summon or create one of these ghouls. Whether you have to use a real living person to do it or a dead body to do it. You have the right magical powers, if you know the right ceremonies, what have you, you can actually create a ghoul. He said ghouls were created to guard tombs in Kuwait and Afghanistan. He said originally used to guard tombs in Kuwait and Afghanistan, but since then, since they were created, they've been let loose. And now they roam the wilderness. They roam the wild deserts of Afghanistan and Kuwait, and presumably other parts of the Middle East as well, because this isn't strictly an Afghani and Kuwaiti cryptid, right? They are used to guard tombs. They've been let loose. So I read that and I thought, this actually, again, this requires you to kind of put on your conspiracy cap with this one, but join me on this journey. Let's assume that these things exist, and let's assume that even some of them, not all of them maybe, but some of them were created to guard these tombs. It probably might not be the best thing to have a flesh-eating ghoul. You're like, I want you to watch after the remains of my loved ones, my family, for generations, as you're telling him. The ghoul's putting on a bib. He's like, oh, yep, totally. I'll watch after him real closely. Because these ghouls were made to surround these tombs. What happens when you have a mystical attachment? You create something and you say you're going to protect this area. You have been created for one purpose. And then, let's say 50, 60 years later, an A-10 Warthog comes screaming overhead and launching a bunch of missiles. There happened to be an Iraqi tank driving right by there. It's Gulf War Part 2. And this tank is just completely obliterated. The whole site is devastated by this attack plane. Is the ghoul unleashed? If it's there to guard a tomb and the tomb is destroyed, what happens to the cryptid? We've talked about that before with haunted houses. We've seen stories where when a haunted house is destroyed, the ghost can still reside in the area. But That's not, ghosts generally, we don't know why they attach to a certain place or why certain ghosts exist. There's some set of rules, because sometimes a ghost can be attached to an item which can be moved from place to place. Sometimes the ghost is attached to a location, and that location is destroyed. The ghost stays there. But the ghost wasn't ordered. It wasn't created to guard that house. When you created a ghoul and you said, I want you to protect the bodies of my lineage, right? You're here, and then it's destroyed. It's more than just a ghost at that point. It's more like if you had a dog and you had this dog fenced in and you're like, dog, I want you to protect my house. And then the hurricane comes and knocks over the house. I guess a good dog would be like, oh, I'm just going to sit here by this broken down house. But if the dog was summoned using the darkest powers of the universe, I'm assuming he'd leave. I'm assuming he's just going to look for people to bite. You have these creatures that have now been released by their bond. It doesn't exist anymore. It's been destroyed. What happens to these ghouls at that point? He also said what is going on. We're taking him at his word. He does say that he's seen a ghoul before, at least. That's more than I can say. He says what else is going on is that powerful families from the Middle East have taken their ghouls with them to come to America. And nowadays, families in America, these powerful families, are creating new ghouls over here. They're creating new ghouls. So I thought about this. For a while. Probably more than I've ever thought about ghouls in my entire life. It all happened in the past week. I've been thinking about it. Is it possible that the crawlers are very recent to it? Because we don't have a lot of sightings of them 20 years back. I didn't even know it was a thing. Like, again, I'm not an expert. I'm not the paragon of everything paranormal or anything like that. But I do look into this stuff all the time. And when I saw one, I didn't even have a term for it. I didn't know what I was looking at. I knew after I kind of walked around and see that it just vanished, that it was something paranormal, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't know anyone else had seen it. I knew that there was a story about a thing called the rake, which I go, well, I guess like the closest is that, but I mean, it wasn't that. Like I saw something real and that was fictional. But then I start seeing that a lot of people are seeing these. Is it possible that what we call crawlers are actually ghouls, and they're actually being imported over here to the United States? And a more interesting question is it possible that because of the multiple wars in the Middle East, where the United States has been the primary driver of those wars, I mean, obviously, freaking stuff like 9/11, I'm not saying they caused them all, but you know what I mean, like, most of these wars, we had the coalition of the willing. There were other countries. There's Britain, France involved. But what I'm saying is that when you think of Gulf War I, Gulf War II, the war in Afghanistan, it's the United States, for the most part, fighting in Kuwait to drive out the Iraqis in the 90s, and then fighting Saddam Hussein in the war in Iraq, and then, you know what I mean. So that destroying these ancestral lands where some of them may have had these ghouls protecting, we've almost invited these creatures over. Now, what's interesting is that when we experience crawlers, we had that story about the woman kind of running out of the cave. We did cover a story. There was a listener, or it was a friend of a listener, where they saw, this kind of throws the whole theory out the window, but I'm sure you guys are like, well, so you want to talk about that? There was like a crawler that could distort time and space, and it got this kid stuck in a time loop. I'll put that episode in the show notes. As far as I know, ghouls aren't that powerful. But I found out a bunch about ghouls recently. Like, again, I mostly thought they were just guys running around in little cloaks, little daggers. Maybe that's goblins. I'm getting them mixed up, right? Maybe ghouls and goblins and ghastlies. But what if we've actually brought these things over? Some of them have been imported willingly, but what if if these are mystical, and we go over and we destroy a bunch of stuff over there they're supposed to be guarding, who's to say they can't come over here. It's a really interesting... It's funny because, one, it's probably a conspiracy theory no one's ever thought about before. If you cause a war in another country and you upset, obviously, their economy is going to take a hit, and their population and their government, all this stuff is going to be hurt. But what about the spiritual ties that bind that community? You're bombing it all. You're destroying it all. There has to be on a metaphysical or spiritual level some sort of ramification for that. So could these crawlers be here that we're seeing now? Are they all post the first Gulf War? Like, if you really looked at the earliest crawler account, are there ones that predate 1990? Because that would be clear. If you could find that there were no reports of these things pre-1990, I think that would give us a fair guess as to what these things were. They could have mystical powers. If they're born from magic, they might be able to do time loops. What's interesting is we don't have a lot of stories. We did have that story about the woman in the cave. We had that story about that young man caught in the time loop. For the most part, we don't have stories where crawlers are killing people. But if I said it once, I've said it 100 times, we hear the stories of the survivors. For all we know that these things do kill living people to eat their dead flesh, they just never tell us that story. No one's going to, write a letter, be posted on Reddit being like, you guys won't believe what happened last night. I was murdered by a monster. If you go over to another country and you actually destroy their shrines and destroy their ancestral homes, their ancestral graveyards, what is the psychic and metaphysical blowback from that? You know what's funny? Because we know it here. There are places that are haunted, and you go, well, yeah, there was a huge battle 200 years ago between the settlers and the indigenous people. The whole idea of the Indian burial ground being cursed if you put a house on top of it, that didn't come from nowhere. People would be like, well, this place is pretty haunted. We did build it on a graveyard, and we didn't know it was there, or we did, and didn't care. So we see it happen here. Could something, if you dropped a bomb on a tomb in Afghanistan that's protected by these ghouls, very powerful ghouls, right? It's not like you're just getting some dummy to protect it. They're being summoned. They're being crafted by these powerful wizards. And then the tomb is destroyed. It's obliterated. There's just nothing left there. A bomb fell directly on it. It's gone. And then that ghoul basically begins its journey. Whether it's teleporting through reality or it just simply starts walking until it eventually gets to America. Better off teleporting. He's all walking into the ocean. He's like, oh yeah, I forgot I can bend reality. I don't know why I'm taking such a long time walking along the Mariana Trench. It's one of those things that if you accept the idea of ghouls, if you accept the idea of these metaphysical monsters that exist in our reality, which I'm open to both of those things. I don't think every story I hear is true. I didn't really, like I said, I never really thought much about ghouls until the other day. But it's possible. I mean, in my worldview, it's possible. And if all of these things are possible or probable, to say that the reason why we have crawlers here now, the reason why we have an issue with these things now, is tied to them coming from the Middle East, either being brought over by families that are leaving the area or simply wandering over here because we destroyed what they were supposed to be doing over there, 100% makes sense. It 100% makes sense. I don't know what to do about it, though. I don't know. That's one of those things, like, if this is an issue, like, I don't know how. Technically, they're not demons. They're summoned with dark magic, but they're not demons. So would any sort of exorcism or spiritual protection protect you from these things? You can pray all you want. If that pit bull's coming after you, I mean, outside of a lightning strike, you're going to have to handle it yourself. And these things could be more biological. Even though they have these abilities, they still could be humans transformed into a ghoul becoming more and more monstrous over time, or could have been something summoned from somewhere, but it's not technically a demon. So could spiritual forces protect you from that? Do you petition the government and say, hey guys, listen, I know you guys like bombing stuff, but don't blow up any graveyards, right? How'd you get in here? You're walking into the Pentagon? You're like, just to let you guys know that if you guys keep bombing graveyards, we might have some severe spiritual ramifications here in the States. So, like, what do you do to stop it there? I don't think the generals would be like, yeah, he brings up a pretty good point, Mr. President. We shouldn't bomb. As crawlers are eating the general, he's like, I don't know why I was just standing here during this whole time. The crawler's eating him. He's like, Mr. President, stop blowing up the grave. Well, like, what do you do to stop this? In fact, the more wars going on, the more likely these things are going to happen. You're upsetting this tribal balance. You're upsetting these places that have been holy for hundreds, if not thousands of years. You drop a bomb on it. You're not thinking about it. You just see a bunch of bad guys running by. You drop a bomb on them. There's a bunch of ghouls start crawling out. You're like, oh, what? Oh, man, I think I've been flying this plane too long. I've been up here for 46 hours on that special amphetamines the military gives me. But I think that's just a hallucination. 100 ghouls come pouring forth. Yeah, what do you do to stop it? If this is real, if this is an actual thing, it definitely could get worse over time. But what I love this, and we'll wrap it up like this, is that if this stuff is true, it does give us some answers to what the crawlers are. Because that's always been, like, what are they, where do they come from, and what do they want? We have those questions answered for a lot of cryptids. We know what Bigfoot is doing there. We know what he wants. Chupacabra, which, again, I'm really iffy. I really don't think the thing exists, but let's just pretend that one does. It's there to drink the blood of goats. It's the goat sucker, right? It lives in Southwest United States, Mexico, Central America, stuff like that. Like, it has its hunting grounds. We know why things are here. We know why cryptids do certain things. The crawler has been a mystery. And if it's a recent mystery, if my hypothesis is correct, we do know why they're here. We do know where they're from. It's not good. In fact, if this theory is correct, they may be the deadliest cryptid out there, because it's not just that they've been freed from their duty, which would be a bad thing for any spirit, right? Not for the spirit might like it, but now it's just this mindless beast. These things are bred to kill humans. That is it. That is the definition of what these things are. They eat the flesh of the dead, and if they have to kill you to make you dead to eat it, they will. There's not many cryptids that have a sole purpose, and that purpose is to kill humans. If this scenario is real, if the ghouls are the crawlers, they are hands down the most deadly cryptid in the United States. And the reason why we don't have report after report after report after report of these things killing people is because the people don't survive. And I'd also argue we don't have a lot of reports of these things even injuring or maiming people. And I think I would argue that's because they're specifically bred to kill. They don't almost get you. We did have that story about the woman running out of the cave, but you know what I mean? If they get you, you're toast. If they actually get a hand on you, you're not able to wrestle it away. The strength is too great. If they stick a 1 foot long claw on you, you're not hobbling away to the hospital and getting it patched up. If these things come after you, if they get their hands on you, you're dead. No ifs, ands, or buts. These could be the answer to a missing 411. This could be the answer to a lot of missing person cases. If ghouls are crawlers, if crawlers are ghouls, they are hands down the most vicious and deadly cryptid in North America at this time. And like I said earlier, there's nothing we can do about it. They've already been unleashed. The only thing we can hope for is that we never have to deal with one ourselves. DeadRabbitRadio@gmail.com is going to be our email address. You can also hit us up at Facebook.com/DeadRabbitRadio. TikTok is at DeadRabbitRadio. Dead Rabbit Radio is the daily paranormal, conspiracy, and true crime podcast. You don't have to listen to it every day, but I'm glad you listened to it today. Have a great one, guys.